What we're going to talk about today is, as we've just spoken, rebounding stronger in recovery. There's a few questions that are actually going to be put up later on, but the three of us are going to give you some of our own views that we have seen within our own respective industries. One thing that I can just touch upon is that our organization has a very strong relationship with the insurance industry. We're retained by double-figure underwriters to respond on perils which are activated through various policies, and that could be, we've talked about cyber, we do kidnap for ransom, hijacking, piracy, detention, product recall, quite a broad spectrum of perils. And one of the things that we saw through the COVID period is a lot of those traditional policies. We saw a drop-off in activations, but at the same time, we saw some consistency in others. So, for example, cyber remained consistent through the COVID period, simply because, you could execute a cyber extortion from your mother's basement. You didn't need to travel. You could be in Eastern Europe and then, arrange or organize a denial of service or a theft of proprietary information through cyber remotely, so you didn't have to move around. We saw the ship piracy, particularly in the Gulf of Guinea and hijacking. We saw that drop right off, and that's not because we didn't see a drop-off in shipping or movements of shipping. We just saw that the threat actors that were traditionally involved in piracy attacks, they ceased their activity, whether they chose to self-isolate or go on and do other things. We saw that trend drop right down. As we've come out of that, we've now seen that spike go right back up again, and we've seen a spike in piracy and hijacking events since we've come out of COVID. And actually, we've seen that the threat actors are far more sophisticated than they were pre-COVID. They are targeting ships further offshore. Their intelligence is much, much better. And they're not just going after crews, they're also going for illegal bunkering and cargo as well. And for the first time, certainly since 2012, when I've been involved in piracy, we've seen Caucasian or white pirates operating in the Gulf of Guinea, which is a first. So these are new trends that are evolving. Threats are changing, and of course, people are adapting. So just hand to my colleague who also, we had a discussion. Yep. Take a seat, we're standing too much. Yeah.
Right, so there's only three of us here, right? So there's some empty seat around us, so, pardon us. So I think I heard a lot commentary about AI, but that's really one of the unstoppable trend, right? But it's moving quick, very fast, but also dangerous, right? If you don't know how to manage it in the right way for cooperation, right? What are the safeguards, that you have to put in place, recognizing, some of the things that AI can do for cooperation, right? So one of the concepts that we are talking every day in Dell, the company that I work for, right, is how to have a frictionless supply chain, And having a frictionless supply chain is a concept that we just started. Right, there's some question on the screen now. But anyway, back to the frictionless supply chain, right? Is how do we incorporate, automation in the daily stuff that we do for supply chain? Still having the human element, but with automation to help us with 80% of the mundane, repetitive tasks that we are doing, and having that liberty of the 20% human injection into strategizing what we want to do or how we want to make things better. So I think I will stop there, but really I just want to bring out the concept of a frictionless supply chain. We can have more conversation about that, but it's a concept that I feel very close to my heart, and I just want to kind of share with the audience today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, yeah. So as I stated within my previous presentation, I don't feel that we're in a recovery section. I actually believe we're in kind of a bridge gap between what was the effects of a global pandemic, not something like coming out of SARS where it was regional, but a complete global meltdown and global shutdown. And then we've had a period of elation coming off the back of COVID where everybody's opened up, businesses started to do business again. But what happened throughout those 2 years was cataclysmic to businesses. There was no operation, there was no money churning, there was no supplies moving, and individuals, i.e. societal individuals, went out of work. Labourers went out of work. There was a mass migration back to countries of origin as well. So those labourers that say were in Malaysia, obviously there was a big problem here in relation to Bangladeshi labourers that were working within the country who went back to Bangladesh, and then there was no production for a certain amount of time until you've started to pull back some of those workers. That ceases and creates problems for that supply chain process. And where we're at the moment, I think what we will find is a lot of multinationals reducing in size, going to more of a local arc, so maybe a franchised arc within local territory and domicile. And then, if you will, working to then region to region to region until item or artifact, whatever it might be, rare earth mineral through to completed goods and move through on a slower supply chain. I think a reliance on AI, and I'm from a company that touts AI and has been for a while. What we will run into with that are problems with regulation. And so what we're seeing at the moment is problems with regulation from both the European Union and problems with regulation from the US and other jurisdictions as well. So to implement AI into your processes at the moment, I would be guarded on that, just due to the fact that those things might change. Don't necessarily run to something that is possibly going to be problematic for your legal departments and for your supply chain activation at the moment. What people don't see within the supply chain either is the supply chain of that certain digital capability, whether it be software or whether it be hardware within their own industry. That's actually forgotten about. Where is that code written? Who controls that code? Who can stop that code? Who's got backdoors into that? That's where the cybersecurity arc comes into play, and then the procurement arc comes in and the legal arc as well. But following on from what I discussed earlier, that is a due diligence process about where those items, those usable tools, technology, software as a system processes come from, and where the data is going to and hosted, most importantly. Thank you.
Just looking at the questions, supply chain disruptions, and that actually just touches on the fact that through through that COVID period, we've seen increased automation and switching to the use of technology over the human factor. I mean, I spent most of last year, or quite a percentage of last year, in Ukraine supporting a lot of clients in the shipping, manufacturing, tech industry. And one of the things that came out there, which again does have an impact on APAC, if you look at countries such as Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, or any country that has national service or mobilization. The issue with Ukraine was, of course, in the early days, everyone believed that, Russian invasion, the Russians would win, second best army in the world. I think the general consensus is now they're the second best army in Ukraine. And the front has largely stabilized, and Ukraine is a vast country, so there has been an attempt to return back to normal, particularly when you've got we can also hear in the news about grain and the shipment of grain, but there's also renewable energy, huge renewable energy in Ukraine, and other manufacturing, and certainly in the tech and other areas which Ukraine was becoming more and more popular. One of the biggest issues that impacted the supply chain was the fact that a large proportion of the male workforce was mobilized into the military. And of course, you look at Taiwan, and if we see any cross-strait tensions, how much of the Taiwanese male population will be mobilized into the military? Same with North-South Korea and increased tensions. So planning around, how do we deal with that loss of male manpower of fighting age, and who steps in, and then, because the supply chain needs to be maintained. We lost the ports because of the mining of the Black Sea, aviation ceased, so there was a huge amount of pressure on the road rail networks and the border crossings, but the loss of male manpower had quite a big impact on the planning and how we would resolve some of those bigger supply chain issues, because the country has adapted to the ongoing conflict, and you'd be surprised how once you get away from the front lines, how life is relatively normal, even though if you see in the daily media that it looks terrible, but actually people are trying to lead lives as best they can. So that was quite a surprise. A lot of people hadn't planned for was the mobilization of the male workforce.
Yeah, so Richard decided not to go with the script, and we'd be kind of flexible with the whole session, right? But I do remember that we really want to talk about some of the balance, right, between cost and risk. And I want to speak a bit more on this, right? So it's kind of like getting people to balance work and life, right? When you talk about risk and cost. Instead of balancing it, I mean, a lot of time we try to find terms to best describe the relationship. Maybe harmonizing it will be a better way, right? Because instead of looking at where and how much we are spending, right? Definitely we want to know, how much that we are spending, but we really need to know where are we spending. Are we spending at the right place? Can security professionals like us articulate why we are spending and what are we protecting, right? So that's where risk assessment comes into the picture. We talk about risk assessment, in a previous session. I think that is fundamental to what we do, but on top of the risk assessment, what are we trying to find out? Risk can be many different types of risks depending on who you talk to, right? Different corporation, different industry, they have different set of risks. But what we want to identify is the threat that we are facing in our industry, right? So articulating the threat, articulating how we're going to protect our business, our asset, and I remember there's one concept that I used many years ago, which I think is still relevant today, is to identify the 3 A's. You need to know your asset, you need to know who your adversary is, and you need to know what their action would be, and that will give us a comprehensive understanding of what we mean by a threat assessment, a risk assessment, and how we can present this to the business, right? So that is one of the things that I feel very strongly. Instead of balancing risk and cost, we need to know where we are spending and how we articulate to the business, and making sure that we are aligned to the business priorities, right? Knowing where our crown jewel is, not protecting things that the security team feels that we should be protecting, but we need to know what it means to the business, So that is one of my point that I think is very relevant for the audience today. Thanks.
There is we've obviously gone slightly off script, but there are some questions that have come through which we can share amongst us. I'll just answer one. Well, I'll attempt to answer one, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues, because it actually is linked to what has just been said, and this whole issue about AI and its growing, popular use. Do we see AI playing a significant part in alerting us to major global events, et cetera, et cetera? Now, I think, certainly from our side, and again, I'll pass on to my colleagues in a minute, that we are seeing a massive explosion in AI. And I think in the next 12 months, a lot of the big tech players are going to be releasing products relating to AI. And it's something that we're using more and more often, because what it does is it speeds up the process of accumulating information, analyzing information, and getting out to the client. The problem with AI is that the AI in itself can be, in a way, infected by a false narrative if it's picking up on fake news, feeding that into the system, and then that becomes part of the story. And there was a recent incident in the US, I think a law firm was using AI to build a case, and actually that AI was feeding in fake news, and they didn't have the checks and balances in place to check whether that news was genuine or whether it was corrupted. And I think the lawyer that was using the system ultimately lost his job. So AI is growing, but you must need the checks and balances in place to make sure whatever you are using it remains accurate. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I can continue with that theme as well. I mean, I can't really see here because there's bright lights on me, but how many people in here actually understand what AI is? Just raise your hands. Handful of people in here. So are you going to put your supply chain in the hands of something that you don't really have a clue about? Probably not. But your CFO, who sees reduction of costs and is talked into purchasing AI, might just do that. And that's a problem because there's not just false narratives, there's false scripts on what this, this equipment can do and where the information's coming from. Essentially, with machine learning, which is the precursor to artificial intelligence and the decisions that are made, is just based on, from years ago, what an SQL database looked like, okay? And then it's gone over to machine learning, graph technology. It matches data across multiple points, and then it provides a visualization or some type of knowledge to you. It answers a question. If that original data is in some way corrupted or there's false news fed into it, that provides you with systematic problems. So as I stated earlier, it's probably best just to slow down and see how this technology starts to successfully process.
Yeah, just want to piggyback what Mark has mentioned here, right? And I think the concept of AI and machine learning is not entirely new, right? We have started talking about this many years ago, maybe like 50 years ago, right? It's an evolution over the last 50 years, but it's a revolution in the last 1 year. When you just heard about ChatGPT just exploded, right? 100 million users in 3 days' time. And that is a revolution, right? And with the speed and the pace that is moving, it comes with a set of danger if we don't know how to manage it, right? The risk that comes with convenience, right? And this is not just AI, it's generative AI. So, I mean, I'm not a cyber expert or not an AI expert, but I do know that the difference between a generative AI is the software can generate new content, right? That is where the danger comes, like what Richard has mentioned, right? How do we differentiate falsehood and the truth? It becomes really muddy, right? If we are not careful with the information that we're seeing with the introduction of generative AI. But that shouldn't stop us from exploring the benefit because it comes with huge benefit for corporation and the processes. So, going forward, there will be a lot of conversation around how do we utilize generative AI, how do we leverage on the benefit of generative AI. And in Dell, I always like to refer back because this is where I feel that we are really thinking ahead, and making sure that we are a responsible organization that use the latest technology to help us deliver results to our customers, right? And to the general community. So we should be really talking about that, but at the same time, we need to be careful, right? About the benefits. So I saw the 1 minute screen that's flashed at us, so I'm going to return it back to you, Richard.
Yeah, it is an interesting topic, one for discussion, socially over a coffee, but certainly I will be touching again on AI tomorrow, but I think that we've all got to remain resilient and, adapt ourselves. We don't want to be Luddites and ignore technology, but we have to be very cautious of what direction it's going in and don't become overly reliant on it because it's easy, and, just be aware of those changes, but also the pitfalls.
Yeah, I'd echo that. There's a question on there that talks about how can we become resilient without digitisation. We've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years within the supply chain mechanism. Okay, globally, that might be a little bit difficult with globalisation over a certain time span. But in terms of local supply chains and local and regional supply chains, that can be done very easily as it always has been.
I think our time is up. Anyway, thank you very much.